Well, hello everyone. As I introduce myself, I'm Duncan, and I'm going to be talking about cyber safety and some recent work by the U.S. government and what it means to nerves and Elixir in general, and actually I think to all software in general, but a little bit of a particular focus on why it's so important to the Erlang ecosystem in general. And apologies, I'll give apologies in advance. I'm not at my peak today. I'm having some health issues, and I did not put the effort into this that I normally do because I've been sick. But I will at least make it through the talk, hopefully. Figure out how to advance the slides. That's not working. That way. So again, a little bit more intro about me. I graduated from RPI back when computers were the size of buildings, literally. Went to work for Bell Telephone Labs, designing processors for telephone switches. I spent most of my career in software, took on cybersecurity probably before some of you were born, back in 1990 when I helped the Air Force, quote, prepare the battlefield for the first Iraqi war. Went back to AT&T and realized what a glass house we lived in, and started up AT&T cybersecurity efforts. I retired from AT&T's Chief Security Office as the Chief Security Architect in 2013. And since then, I've been pretty much doing pro bono work in cybersecurity standards, cyber safety, do a little bit of consulting on the side, and finally have time to actually play with things like nerves and Elixir and learn Elixir and stuff like that. We used Erlang some at work. Why won't the slides advance? There we go. So again, this is going to be sort of my opinions of the world. You're definitely going to hear some of my soapbox versions on this. Some of the stuff we'll be talking about, I've actually been an advocate for quite a number of years. If you heard me talk at Codebeam, I'm going to hit on a couple topics that I've hit on in the past, but I like to feel justified because now some of the things I've said are being said by the President of the United States in something called the Executive Order on Improving the Nation's Cybersecurity. I'm going to touch on the executive order several times throughout the talk. It was issued last May. It was Executive Order 14028, if you're interested in keeping track of EO numbers. But I think it's going to be a true game changer, and I'll cover why in a little bit. But to start with, I just wanted to start with a little bit of defining cybersecurity and why it should matter. There's a really great quote in the EO that I wanted to go ahead and show everybody, and I'll even just read the whole thing. In the end, the trust we place in our digital infrastructure should be proportional to how trustworthy and transparent that infrastructure is, and to the consequences we will incur if that trust is misplaced. I'm going to touch on this several times throughout the talk because there's a really lot of meat in that very simple sentence, but it is really the crux of what cybersecurity is. So why should we care about cybersecurity? All cybersecurity talk should have a certain amount of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt in them, where we scare people. And I'm going to go through a little bit of that, but it's because it's particularly important to the nerves community, because it used to be, it just mattered. Cybersecurity really just mattered in the early days when I was first years in computers. It really just mattered because it'd screw up your presentation or your Word document or something. Then it got around to, hey, now people can steal money with it. Fortunately, lately, it's got into people can get hurt. And that's why it sort of matters more. And all said and done, nerves is one of those intersections of software with cyber physical systems in a lot of cases. And that's why it's important that the people in the nerves community understand cybersecurity, and why I want to get on my soapbox with some of this stuff. Did want to mention an organization that I'd recommend if you're at this talk. You probably want to join it because you probably like nerves. That means you probably have something to do with cyber physical systems, which means you probably should care about cyber safety. As I said, spend most of my time doing pro bono work. One of the organizations I'm in is something called I Am the Cavalry. And it's from the phrase, the cavalry is coming. No, they're not. So I am the cavalry. So we all got to do it ourselves. It's a grassroots organization, and it's focused on the intersection of digital security, public safety, and human life. They have a lot of really nice, pithy sayings that I like to relate. Some of them are up there. I'll cover a couple of them in a minute. The organization got founded around 9 years ago. I am not a founding member. I joined at the second meeting, okay? And at that meeting, I sort of bent the group's ear on something called SBOMs, which I'm going to talk about at length in this talk, software, bills, and materials. But why do I mention I Am the Cavalry? Because it is a grassroots organization. You can just join it as individuals. It's a fun group of people. Now, one of their particularly pithy sayings that's, again, applicable to this community: if you can't protect it, don't connect it. Okay, well, if you're building nerve boxes, you're probably building them and connecting them to the internet, which means you should worry a little bit about cybersecurity and cyber safety. And some particular aspects of that I'll cover a little bit. And particularly in the cyber safety realm, one of their catchy phrases is where bits and bytes meets flesh and blood. So bits and bytes, what do you mean? It means software. Okay, in particular, it means IoT software and the kinds of things that nerves run, things that are connected to the internet and do things like control the electric grid and utilities, or control cars, planes, and trains, or in factories and industrial control, robotics, or in the world of healthcare. Okay. For example, I know how to hack pacemakers. I actually know how to kill people with software, which is not a good thing. So bits and bytes meets flesh and blood. So what do we mean by the meets flesh and blood part? Well, it means there can be accidents. And unfortunately, the accidents aren't all accidental. Things can blow up, people can get hurt, and people can die. And it's actually already happening, unfortunately. And that is why safety is important. So as part of the obligatory FUD part, go over a bunch of hacks of recent that have sort of been building. And basically, since I've started preaching cybersecurity, many more people listen now than used to when I started, because unfortunately, there's been a lot of consequences. Electric utility, obviously, the Ukrainian hack of several years ago has gotten a lot of attention more again lately because of the Ukrainian war, and everyone's sort of waiting for the Russians to do it again, not only to Ukraine, but to us and to many other places. It's a denial of service attack. Cybersecurity consists of what's called CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. We'll go into that a little bit more. But availability is, again, something the nerves crowd's very familiar with because it's built on top of OTP and the Erlang under systems. So again, I'll cover a little bit on why our environment is so applicable to meet a lot of these needs. In other words, if everyone had been using nerves in the first place, we wouldn't have had half these problems. Other hacks that have went on, I'm sure you're aware of the hackers that tried to poison a town in Florida outside of Tampa by basically fiddling with the water purification system and dumping the chemicals in. They got caught, or they at least got prevented. The actual individuals didn't get caught, but no one actually got hurt in that. But it's, again, a potential. Those were actual cyber hacks. One of the things I like to do sort of to help people think about it, I think I put up before there my tagline of think evilly, act ethically, but is for people to think about, hey, if you were a bad guy, what would you do bad? And again, having been in the business of doing it for a while, one of the things that you use to sort of spur how to think that way is look at just bad things that happened that had nothing to do with cyber and say, hey, could I cause that same thing to happen? Not too many years ago, just a few years back, there was a gas utility that got overpressured. It basically got overpressured by mistakes in automated systems and some human errors. But again, it would have been possible to cause the same problem with a cyber attack. It did. This particular one wasn't a cyber attack. And what happens, of course, when you overpressure gas lines is they leak. Gas leaks, it causes a house to burn down. The issue wasn't that a house burned down. The issue was that a really, really lot of houses burned down, all the red dots there. And all the yellow dots were houses that could have burned down. This is a suburb just outside of Boston. And these were all houses that could have burned down, but fortunately the gas leak occurred, but the spark never occurred. And that's the kind of thing that you now have to worry about when you have to worry about bad people doing bad things. This is a simulated case. The guy on the gurney there is a friend of mine by the name of Bo Woods. It was back in 2018, and the poor woman standing there is an actual physician, an actual doctor who was asked to come into the RSA conference, which is the largest security conference in the world. About 50,000 people attend. And doctors are taught by the watch one, I'm forgetting the phrase, whatever. There's three steps. The third, you teach it. Let's see.
Learn one, see one, yeah. Do one, teach one.
That's it, exactly. And, whoops. And they said, hey, show us how you do that with, say someone's having a heart attack. Well, let's pretend Bo's having a heart attack. What's he supposed to do? How do you do this teaching thing? And they do this live on stage, and she's up there. And of course, it's a hacker conference, so it's a security conference. So they had the hackers literally hack into the infusion pump that she was using, and they faux killed Bo as part of that. Made the news, made a big deal. Everyone got all worried about medical devices, which sort of prompted a lot of effort that I'll get into in a moment. It really was sort of the crux that was the first step on the way towards the executive order. But unfortunately, it didn't just happen, in the news at hacker conferences. Fairly major hospitals have been taken down for a certain amount of time. Ransomware is so rampant nowadays, everyone's used to it. But when the first big hospital got taken down, which is a major hospital out in LA, it was a really big deal in the community. But it was nothing compared to literally just a few months later, WannaCry took out 1/4 of the hospitals in England. A really, really lot. And they're now doing epidemiological studies to see how many people died. They can't say, hey, this particular person died because of it. But if you delay care just by minutes, particularly in this case of heart attacks and strokes, if you delay care just by minutes, it actually increases the mortality rate significantly. And there was probably on the order of thousands of deaths that occurred because of that particular cyber attack. And that cyber attack wasn't even an attack intended to go against the hospitals. It was intended for other places, and it sort of accidentally infected the hospitals and caused that, which was really bad. The energy stuff I mentioned before, the Russian attack of Ukraine. There's been some other ones. In fact, one of the very first attacks on the United States many, many years ago, back in the early 90s, was actually an attack on a utility by a foreign nation. Besides, of course, all the sort of cyber-physical stuff, there is the classic ones that are always in the news associated with financial breaches, target sort of old hat nowadays. But there is all said and done financial impact to all of this stuff too. And 18.5 million seems like a fairly low amount, and it actually is, because when Target got all said and done, I think their total was around 200 million. That was just a settlement of a particular lawsuit for that headline. In more recent times, one of the big hacks that I'm sure you've heard of in the news was something called SolarWinds. There was what's called a supply chain attack. That's really going to get into where a lot of the meat of what I'll be talking about is the attackers have figured out that, hey, yeah, if you can't attack the actual thing you're trying to attack the supply chain of it. Get in through the back door. In fact, most of the back doors to things are through supplied components. And that was, in this particular case, they took over a system that actually downloaded software into lots of, among other things, government systems, and caused a really big deal, particularly in the government community, and probably I would say the single largest contributor to the executive order was the SolarWinds attack, because it prompted a big commission. The commission went out and studied a bunch of stuff and said what to do. And then the results of the commission is a lot of what went into the executive order. And I'll talk a little bit about more of that. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of other ones like Colonial Pipeline, the meat supplying case. And Log4j is a particularly good one for our community because it wasn't in Elixir or Erlang or any of our languages. It was in Java. And so we can easily say, hey, that wasn't us. And that's a good thing for some other stuff I'll be talking about a little bit later in the talk on how, because it matters not just can you be hacked, it also matters the sort of telling everybody, particularly in an automated, quick way, hey, no, that one isn't going to bother us. The ones that are going to bother you, you do got to worry about, but the ones that are not going to bother you, you got to have a way to tell people about. I'll cover that a little bit also in a little bit. But this sort of slowly building a really, really lot of things going on, in my mind, is very analogous to events that happened in the 60s. I'm actually old enough to remember the 60s. And basically, when I was a kid, the world was, you guys might not believe it, but the world was really a lot more polluted place than it is today. And this particular picture is in the late 60s. And if you were to look at this picture today, what would behind that big black cloud would be the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland. And the Cuyahoga River is what's running down the middle there. And it's actually the river that is on fire. Okay. And this particular fire, the one that's in this photo, is the one that's basically attributed with causing the formation of the EPA and the formation of the Clean Water Act. I moved my hands too much. I hit my keyboard, it screws stuff up. But anyway, what's interesting about this is, although this particular fire was sort of seen as the catalyst that sort of broke the camel's back, but what's important to note is this was the 17th time the river had caught on fire over decades. Okay, it wasn't like the first incident caused it. It was just like incident after incident after incident, not just in Cleveland, but in other cities and all over the country, that finally, the political will got built up to say, hey, enough is enough. Let's clean up the pollution and have a cleaner earth. And that's what resulted from it. It was pretty landmark. I actually think this sort of unfortunate series of events that have happened in the last year that finally have galvanized the US federal government to do things like the executive order, it's basically the culmination of that effort. And it's probably not the end of it. There's obviously much more to do because it is an executive order. The president can only tell the executive branch of government what to do. He can't tell industry what to do. He can't tell the legislator what to do, and he can't tell the judicial branch what to do. But he can tell the executive branch what to do. And the executive branch spends $1 trillion a year on buying stuff. So they have this thing called the FARs, the Federal Acquisition. I don't know if it's requirements or I don't remember what the R is, but it's basically the rules by which the U.S. government buys stuff. And if you add a FAR that says, hey, you got to do X, then you're not going to sell to the U.S. government if you don't do X. And one of the things, or many of the things in the executive order are associated with tasking various U.S. government agencies with, hey, look at how to, for example, require SBOMs for anything built with software that the U.S. government buys. Now that applies to, F-35 fighter jets, but it also applies to Windows computers. It applies to everything because they buy basically everything. And it applies not just to what's bought by the federal government directly, because sort of once you do it for the federal government, a lot of big corporations are going to say, hey, they can require it. I should require the same thing for pretty much the same reasons. Or conversely, oh, I better do it because I want to sell to the government. Or even though I sell to the government this product, I also want to sell this product to everybody else. And since I've already done it, I've already done this stuff they're required me to do to make the cybersecurity better. So I think it's really going to ripple pretty far because of that. Again, same phrase that I talked about before. I'm going to parse it a little bit different because when you get right down to it, what this is saying is this is a risk equation. Okay, and a lot of what cybersecurity is really just risk trade-offs. Okay, you're deciding what's the risk of something happening and what effort should you put in to prevent it. And you want the banks have the easiest job at doing this. How much money is going to get stolen? How much money will keep to prevent it? If the prevention money is less than the stolen money, then they do it, and they're much better at doing a lot of that because of it. Federal government has NIST guidelines on how to do this risk management. It's really complicated, got lots of stuff in it. And when you get all said and done, it just comes down to money. This is from, in my opinion, this is my humble opinion. This is me on my soapbox again. This particular slide is from Jerry Maguire. He's screaming into the phone at the top. Tom Cruise is screaming into the phone at the top of his lungs, show me the money. And I sort of use this in all my talks, is that's what it really gets down to in cybersecurity. Is it's just a risk equation, and you should be looking at how much is to spend to prevent the problem or fix a problem, or to not do that, what's it going to cost you in the long run, and look at the total cost of ownership. And that's actually harder to do than you think, but it's actually easier to do than most people realize. So a lot of that FUD that I showed you was to show you, get you scared on, hey, we got to do all the cybersecurity stuff. The problem with fear is it's not a great long-term motivator. It sort of short circuits the rational part of the brain, which is why vendors like it so much, and why cybersecurity has built itself up to $1 trillion industry, because vendors can really scare everybody to do everything. What we really should be doing is making intelligent security decisions based on actual risk equations using actual dollars. And if you were to do that, I think you'd discover that you need to build better software to begin with, rather than buy bolt-on firewalls and intrusion detection devices and all the stuff that goes into this $1 trillion cybersecurity business. So for business decisions, money is a really good metric, and it's really good to use if you do the math correctly. But there are ways to do it, and ways that are, this particular book here is a book on how to do it. If you have anything to do with cybersecurity, I think you should read this book. If you have anything to do with software, I think you should read this book. I actually think this book should be required reading for any, curriculum associated with software. It actually is in about, I think, 8 colleges now as part of the cybersecurity curriculum. But I actually think it should be just anybody that has anything to do with software. You should understand that all said and done, it's just a risk equation. Now, first of all, this is a textbook. It reads a little bit like a textbook, so it's not going to be your light weekend reading, but it's got a really lot of good concepts in it. I do recommend it. I actually found out about this book, interestingly enough, at a code beam about 6 years ago. I'd actually given, I think, one of the lightning talks on something or other I was doing in cybersecurity, and just somebody walked up to me, asked if I'd read it, and I said no. I went out and got it, and I've literally included it in every talk I've ever given since then. It's again, a lot of really good stuff in it. Partly of interest to the cybersecurity community is we're pretty geeky and pretty think we're unique and think we're the only people that sort of have this weird cybersecurity problem. And it turns out, from a math viewpoint, from a modeling viewpoint, a lot of the problems in cybersecurity are actually, there are models to model it that are based on work that's been done in the financial industry, in the insurance industry, in the disaster recovery industry, that are all associated with massive risk, minimal data, and profoundly chaotic actors. And there's it's called quants. There's a lot of quantitative methods around doing it, and it's not rocket science. You can literally do it in an Excel, spreadsheet. So it's just, you got to do statistical math as opposed to 1+1 math. But I, again, highly recommend that book. Risk is one of the things in the executive order that we should sort of be moving away from red, yellow, green into more quantified risk things. Another thing in the executive order, just touching on a couple topics in it, I'll focus on the one I care about most in a second. But one of the other topics in it is automation. And automation, again, is one of these ones that's really important to looking at the underlying economics of trade-offs of the risk and the threat problems versus the best ways to mitigate or solve it. Automation means speed, it means reduced risks, and it means money saved. This particular work is from work done at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, i.e. the nuclear weapons crowd. And they showed that automating their cybersecurity resulted in a 2 order of magnitude reduction in the time the hackers were in the system. Now, these are pretty secure systems to begin with, so the attackers were only in there for a couple of weeks on average. Most systems hackers are in for months to years before people notice them. But they did get their weeks down to hours, which, if you're talking nuclear weapons, it's really important to actually keep them out entirely. But it's a whole lot harder to do damage, to actually get all the way in and do everything you need to do in a few hours, whereas it is very possible to do everything in a few weeks. So this sort of 2 order of magnitude reduction is a really big deal. So if you're looking at data to plug into those, that green book I showed you on how to justify doing the work you need to do in cybersecurity, it's actually pretty easy to economically justify that this stuff is worth it from a total cost of ownership viewpoint. Back to the executive order, as I said, it mentioned the cybersecurity, automation was part of it. It has a fair amount in it on software development lifecycle. I'll touch on that a little bit, but first, sort of big picture again, this sentence is sort of saying what cybersecurity is in a nutshell, in the way that people traditionally have thought of cybersecurity. In other words, the way they meet that sentence. This was something I think I mentioned a little bit ago called the CIA triad. It's not the Central Intelligence Agency. It's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality, private communications and data. Integrity, nobody changes your data, either at rest or in transit. Availability, the system and your data are there when you want them to be there. They're pretty simple to say. They're really hard to do, given, as was shown by all those FUD events I showed you earlier. But the community is sort of evolving away from CIA, or at least evolving to a different triad as a way to meet CIA, or to make the aspects of it less, to make the impact of not doing the things less bad, is with something called the DIE triad, okay, or DIE, which is the distributed, immutable, ephemeral, I never say that word right, property. And if you look at that, that's really, we are tailor-made. We in this community are tailor-made to meet systems that meet the DIE triad. We're a functional programming language, we're a distributed system, and the sort of consequence of how we do things is there is a lot of very temporary things that go on the ephemeral. We make all three of those very easily. And so OTP originally came out as, open Telcom Platform back in the 80s. Ericsson made it as part of the insides of telephone switches. That's why they created Erlang. They created the libraries on top of it to do OTP. Elixir is a very quirky language. I'm sorry, Erlang is a quirky language for those of you, because it is an 80s language for those of you who still program in it. I programmed in it for a number of years. Elixir came along to make our lives a whole lot easier and easier to program. But Elixir is built on top of Erlang, which is built on and has all those Erlang OTP libraries as part of it. So I have something I've been promoting for several years now is people should stop saying OTP stands for Open Telecom Platform. It really stands for One Tough Platform, because it really does meet the DIE triad there. The availability is sort of at the heart of it. And because of things like the let it fail aspects, the let it fail was not just to find hardware faults, it's also for software faults. So it's much more forgiving. So from a security viewpoint, it's a much better system for designing security systems, which is why, back when I was at AT&T, that's why we used Erlang, because we were building some of the actual security systems for AT&T, which are sort of you especially have to have them meet your security requirements, not just because the cobbler's children can't go barefoot, but also because it is the first system the attackers attack. Back in the I mentioned my early experience with the military in helping the military with the first Iraqi war. The first thing the Air Force takes out in any attack is the enemy radar. Well, the security systems of any company are the enemy radar. So when I worked at AT&T, we sort of knew we were what everyone was going after. So availability was the goal, but DIE sort of comes along for free. It's a great, I do think in general, Nerves, Elixir, Erlang, all of them are particularly good for being better at meeting security requirements naturally. Again, you can hack any system, you can design poorly in any system. It's easier to design correctly in our environments. So we have sort of a natural advantage that we probably should be taking more advantage of. But let me sort of get into, I'll say, the meat of what I care really a lot about that was in the executive order. And that's something called Software Bill of Materials, or SBOM. It's been a consuming passion of mine for coming up on 2 decades. I never actually heard the acronym till 2013. The second I heard it, I've used it like every day of my life ever since. But the concept of it, I got involved in some government work, actually in the early aughts, some of the first internet connected government systems, built some of the security gateways for and stuff. And the government had this really onerous requirement of us having to, because they were really high security systems, of us having to understand our software and know everything in it. And I was the chief architect of AT&T, and we built the first one. I was the chief architect of the response. And I complained about it, yelled about it, did it, and have been a fan of it ever since. It's a pain in the butt to do, but it really, really helps, and it's really useful. Of course, I haven't explained what it is yet, and I'll explain what is an SBOM. No, actually, I won't. I'm going to divert for a second and talk about a Old English expression. Some people look at this expression, "Don't buy a pig in a poke," and they think they're talking about you shouldn't buy pork in Asian lunch bowls, and that's not what it's talking about. Okay, it's actually, a poke is a burlap bag. And one of the very earliest known scams back from the Middle Ages, okay, was to go to market and sell piglets in bags. And what was in the bag was not a piglet. It was a cat or a rat or a squirrel or some feral animal you caught and stuck in the bag, and which was worth absolutely nothing or negative, and sold at market for a nice price, because piglets are worth a lot of money. So what's the expression, "Don't buy a pig in the poke" mean? It means you should open the bag. You should know what you're buying, which means you really shouldn't buy most software, because most people, I'll say including all of you and all of the software you develop, don't actually know all the software that's in the software that you're using. Now, some people like Frank do, because he's heard me preach about SBOMs before, and I know follows that stuff now. But in general, the efficiency of reuse of software means you don't have to design code because somebody else already did it, and you just use it, okay? And all an SBOM is, okay, is a dependency tree. It's the, hey, what are you dependent on? But not just what are you dependent on, what's it dependent on, and what's it dependent on sort of, turtles all the way down. And so that you actually know all your components. So you know whether you have log, if you're a Java library, you know whether you have log4j in it. Yeah, if you're in Elixir, you're pretty certain you don't have log4j. You don't know you don't have, I don't know, OpenSSL version 9.1, which is which Heartbleed could take out. Because again, that's in a C NIF down pretty far that you'd have to actually do the SBOM to know if it's in there. Turns out it's not, but just using that as an example. So software bill of materials is like the ingredients list on your food, okay? Except for it's a nested inventory, which again, sometimes when you look at food, they got the little parentheses on them that says, this is made up of these other things. Just in software, it's usually a lot more complicated. And the government definition of it is a formal record containing the details and supply chain relationships of various components used in building software. And all said and done, when you get fancy about it, it's not just the components, it's the provenance of the components. Where'd they come from? Who built them? Do we trust them? Or what do we know about them, et cetera? So who uses an SBOM for what? There are many use cases for a lot of different reasons. This one I sort of focus on because I'm a cybersecurity geek is the cybersecurity one, but there are also licensing reasons for do it, and there's also just plain old architecture reasons for do it. I've yet to be involved in it. Some of the consulting I do, I've yet to be involved in any organization that's done an SBOM that the developer didn't do some sort of aha moment when they looked at what was actually in their software. Like they had 3 versions of the same thing in there. Or worse yet, they had 2 copies of even the same version, but they had 2 different copies of it. It was over here to do this and over there to do that. There's just a lot of inefficiency that once you sort of look at the components, you can understand it better. But again, the main one that I care about is cybersecurity. And the cybersecurity one, again, even that one benefits sort of all the different parts of the development pipeline. There's the people who produce the software. They help you in this architectural use case, but they also help you in the all said and done when the vulnerabilities come out later, people have to go back and patch stuff, and sort of the unplanned for, unscheduled work costs money and screws up the schedule of the other stuff you're doing while you panic and go try to either half the time try to figure out whether you're even impacted by it, even though you're not. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a little bit. It's useful for the people who purchase software because it helps you understand whether a risk transference is being done. If the organization that you're buying your software from sort of does this well, then you have a higher trust factor in what they did, and that they're not transferring risk to you. If they don't know what's in their software, then all said and done, particularly because the way EULAs and everything are written today nowadays, they're basically transferring all the risk from the supplier to the consumer, and it's sort of on you that you're going to get hacked. Because all said and done, it's the users of the software that get hacked, not the suppliers of the software. And again, similarly for those who operate the software, they're usually where the rubber meets the road with respect to vulnerability management, getting the patches in, fixing the security devices that are needed because of the fact that all these software vulnerabilities exist. So even though I've been preaching SBOMs for a long time, SBOMs sort of in the general software community are still a pretty new thing, but they're a really, really fast moving thing. Gartner just put out a study. They put out a study last year that had basically the 5% number for 2021 and a 40% number for 2025. They just put out a report in the last month or two that they've upped their 40% to 60% by 2025. So basically, it's a thing that's catching on. So even if you never heard of it, you say, yeah, it'll take forever to get to me. Things like the federal government saying, hey, we're not going to buy any software that doesn't have this in it once we figure out how to change the FARs, which will still probably take them a year. But it's going to have a ripple effect. There are already organizations, particularly in the medical device industry, in the electric utility industry, that are already starting to put it in their purchasing recs that basically, hey, if nothing else, we got to work out the details of, you don't necessarily have to publish it. You don't even necessarily have to tell me it, but you better at least have one of your own so that we know your processes will be able to react to things like WinLog4j or any one of the literally thousands of what are called CVEs, which I'm going to forget what the government acronym stands for, but whatever, the Common Vulnerability Enumeration. It's a really weird acronym. But basically, the government keeps a database of all basically known vulnerabilities. So should you be doing an SBOM? I really like this chart. Do you care about security? Yes, then you should be having an SBOM. Do you care about security? No, well, you should be. So yeah, you should be having an SBOM. So again, it's an ingredients list, but what's that mean for software? That NTIA website I talked about, again, I'm prejudiced because I helped write a lot of the documents on it, but has a lot of good information on how to do stuff and where to find stuff. And the work is now transitioning from NTIA over to CISA, because as part of the executive order, it said, hey, NTIA sort of get industry harmonized on all this stuff, and then CISA, go make the federal government do it. So CISA is now in that go make the federal government do it phase. But you got this real simple NERVs box that gets sold as Acme Appliance 1.1. It's got bingo buffer in it and Bob's browser, and those are its two components. Okay, it's a really simple example. But it turns out you don't really know as much about Bob's browser as you think you could. It's got Carol's compression engine, but it's got some other stuff in it. You don't know what it is. So there's this concept in SBOMs of known unknowns. An SBOM with known unknowns is still better than no SBOM at all. And any, what's called a one-hop SBOM that didn't even have Carol's compression in it. It only had the bingo buffer and Bob's browser. That would still be useful. It's more useful the more complete it is. And so this concept of known unknowns is an important concept. And over time, it'll get filled in. And I think in our community, that's an area where later I'm going to basically ask for all your help, because we need to start for our stuff filling that in, particularly in open source kind of thing that's really well done crowdsourced. You only have to do it once. You only have to do it for NERVs once. Well, you have to do it for every build. But once you build it into the build process to create it, then it just happens naturally, and you go from there. And then it uses some particular component. Well, we got to talk to them to put it in their build process and working your way down there. Formats wise, again, not the cleanest thing in the world. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. Could talk for hours at length on the different formats. In my humble opinion, it doesn't matter which one you pick. It's just data. They all have the same data in between them, and there's tools to convert between them. Okay. For those of you who are old enough like me, if you remember the VI versus Emacs fights, it's a religious war. It really doesn't matter. It's whichever one you like better, and whichever one you use, you can convert to the other one. The top two are definitely much more in use than the bottom one. The bottom one is a sort of govy thing that has not evolved as quickly as either Cyclone or SPDX. But SPDX came out of the licensing world. It's older. It's been around for a while. You really should know the licenses of the software you use. There could be some copyleft thing in there that requires you to do stuff you don't realize, or some rule that says you can't sell it to certain companies or stuff like that. So you really should understand your licenses. Where SPX came from, but they've added vulnerability stuff to it. Cyclone DX came out of OWASP, the open web security people, application security people, and they made this great tool called Dependency Track, which if you don't use, I'd recommend you should. It's an open source tool that basically says, hey, look at your dependencies and let's see if there's any vulnerabilities in them. Go look this stuff up in this national vulnerability database I talked about and tell you whether they're critical or minor or whatever. And to do that, you sort of need the input of what software you use. So they invented this format called Cyclone DX to be hey, here's how we put our list of ingredients in. So it started out as a security thing. It's the one I sort of like a little better because that's where I started with it, was from security. But the reality is, it now has licensed stuff in it, and the reality is the SPDX stuff has vulnerability stuff in it, and there's tools from both sides that convert to the other one, so that it really doesn't matter. The reason I promote Cyclone DX a little bit better is because in that long list of tools they have, hex/SBOM is one of the tools. In other words, you can, if you write in Elixir, you can make SBOMs as part of your build. Okay, it's an easy enough thing to do. It's not a big deal. If you write in Erlang, rebar 3_SBOM is a module you can use to make Erlang SBOMs. So no big deal to do it. I mean, it's a big deal because you got to understand it. You got to put it into your build thing, but it's not like you have to invent you have to understand these formats and invent all the details. You just got to use them. So that's one of my main takeaways for everyone is going to be, hey, you should be doing more of this. Now, all right, so we start creating SBOMs. We got lots of these SBOMs out there, and some of these other documents I'm going to talk about in a second. Well, what the heck do you do with all of them? Well, you should use them. And to use them means you sort of got to keep track of them. So there's another open source project and a standards project run by the Open Cybersecurity Alliance, which is an OASIS group, OASIS standards group, that's basically trying to get software cybersecurity automation, get all the tools talking to each other over vendor agnostic interfaces. And they have this project called PACE, which is Posture, Attribute, Collection, and Evaluation. And they're not talking about whether I'm standing up straight. They're talking about your security posture. And one of the big components of your security posture is your SBOMs and whether there's vulnerabilities in them and whether these things called vexes, I'm going to talk about in a second, in them. And so it's a project to try and basically build standardized interfaces to systems that'll keep track of all this stuff for you. And there are actually vendors out there now that will already do it. I'll give you a minor ad for one of them in a second that I'm associated with. But I'm actually more of a proponent of this sort of open way to do it, because if they all have the same interfaces, then I can actually use multiple of the vendors at once to get the best view of my security posture. So get a little bit more techie slide that's probably too tiny to read, and I'll make the slides available to everybody. But basically, you need to do things like, I need to go out and get the SBOMs for whatever systems that I'm working on. I need to keep them somewhere so that's a posture collection system to go get them. I need to keep them somewhere. That's a posture attribute repository. And then the important part is I need to do this evaluation of them. I have to look at the data. I have to say, hey, here's my components. Here's the new CVEs that just came out today. Do any of these CVEs affect any of my components? And if they are, what should I do about it? As I mentioned, there are commercial products that do this. I still do consult a little bit, try to keep it to under 20% of my time. I spend 80% free and 20% for pay. And a small percent of that per pay is actually by this company called Cybeats, which sort of makes a pay system. It basically makes a SBOM repository system called SBOM Studio. And my only reason for bringing it up, because I know we're not supposed to do commercials, but I am connected to them. And if particularly from the startup world, any of you guys that are in startups, and even if you're some of the bigger companies, I could probably wrangle you some free copies of this if you wanted to start playing in SBOM. And what would be in it for Cybeats, what didn't mean it for you is, hey, you get an actual tool that helps you do this stuff. What would be in it for Cybeats is they're trying to expand their sort of reach into different programming languages and different stuff. And all said and done, their libraries of Elixir dependencies are pretty weak. I think everything in there I put in there, and I haven't done enough yet. So if they could sort of get more people from our community involved using their tool, it sort of builds their data. Because like I said, this is crowdsourced stuff. It's best done sort of by everybody doing their little piece and then adding it up. So anybody who's interested in that, get a hold of me offline, and I'll put you in sync with them and talk them into giving you some stuff for free, hopefully. Now, talked a lot about SBOMs, spent just a little bit on something that's been a really big deal to most of the industrial people involved in the SBOM standards work I've been doing. And that is whenever you bring up, hey, you have a vulnerability in your software, I was like, wait. Yes, it's vulnerable, but it doesn't mean it's exploitable. So cybersecurity geeks distinguish between the fact that there's a potential there's something that you can take advantage of, and whether or not in an actual particular system you're talking about, you can actually get at that. So for example, OpenSSL 0.9 has the Heartbleed bug in it that you need to have a later version to not be heartbleedable. So maybe you have in your software library OpenSSL 0.9, but maybe the reason you have it in there is because you needed a random number generator. You don't actually even use it for your crypto, for your communications crypto. So it's not actually attackable from a Heartbleed viewpoint. And you know that, but your customers don't know that. And they're going to yell at you and scream at you and say, yeah, but my scanning tools say that you have OpenSSL 0.9. And you say, yeah, but it can't bother me. And you just get flooded with support calls. And so one of the big resistance over the last few years in these committees I've been on to doing this SBOM stuff is this worry about flood of support calls. So we have another standard that's recently been created called VEX, which is the Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange. And it's a different document that sort of go with your SBOM, except it really goes more with the CVE. Okay, and it's useful in flowcharts. This happens to be a Cacao flowchart. Cacao is a standard on how to pass playbooks around for security stuff. So if I sort of get hacked and figure out how to beat the hack, I can make one of these playbooks that both my systems can use, but then I can share with my peers or share around my company even, so that all of our systems are sort of prepared to to prevent this particular kind of hack. And it's sort of a playbook on playbooks on how to do security. And so one of the issues is sort of, hey, well, does it have an SBOM for this particular CVE? Does it impact it? If the CVE is potentially impacting to this software, so we know there's a potential vulnerability, has the vendor put out a VEX, a document that says, yep, it does bother me. I need to get you a new version, or says, no, it doesn't bother me because of this, open SSL example I gave before. Or for example, in the case of Log4j, if any of you got bugged last December with, hey, are you affected by Log4j? You could have easily put out a VEX, and I've actually done this on my website, that said, no, I am not affected. And I'll even tell you why. I'm not affected because the component's not present. It's in Elixir. If it's in Elixir, it doesn't have Log4j in it. That's a Java thing. And so it's weird that there's probably going to end up being more VEXs than there are SBOMs, because you make sort of the SBOM once, but you make lots of VEXs as people bug you about particular CVEs. And as a security geek, just saying it's not affected isn't good enough to me. Saying component not present, I go, okay, great, I don't need to worry about it. If they say, no, it's there, I don't use it. Any good hacker knows that just because you don't call it doesn't mean I as a hacker can't call it. So I don't, particularly in my security work, I don't trust that one as much. It's still better that you don't call it. It's less of a risk than if you're calling it, but it's still a risk, and it's a risk greater than zero. It's a lot lower risk, or a lot higher risk than the component not present. So if you produce software, you should know what's in it, including all the components from third parties. If you purchase or use software, you should require your suppliers to know the components in their software, and go to either nti.gov/SBOM or CISA.gov/SBOM, and you can know lots more about this stuff. Showed this slide earlier on the formatting stuff. Again, the important takeaway from it is hex/SBOM. Use SBOMs in your builds. If you're doing Erlang stuff, use rebar 3/SBOM. Could get into a lot more details on that stuff, but I wanted to keep this, wanted to train you more in cybersecurity, since I think you guys probably know nerves and Elixir and all that stuff probably at least as well as I do. Give an example of one, I'll give a couple examples, not in detail, because again, it'd be a really boring slide, but a couple examples where I have made SBOMs and used them. Again, sort of as a teaching tool as well. I'm involved in the RSA conference. Last year's involved in last year's, which is all virtual. I'm involved in this year's, which is coming up in 2.5 months, out in San Francisco. Really big deal, 50,000 people. It is sort of the biggest cybersecurity conference from the vendor side. DEF CON's sort of biggest cybersecurity conference from the sort of hacker side, and all said and done, RSA is about twice the size of DEF CON. Both are huge. One's 25,000, one's 50,000. But part of RSA has this thing called Supply Chain Sandbox, and normally it's a place you go and we sort of talk about hacker stuff and how you attack the supply chain and what you can do about it. And last year we were all virtual, so a lot of the sort of tricks and stuff we'd done the previous year didn't work. So they said, hey, we need a game. We need a game we can play on the internet, as opposed to walk in a room and play with blocks and stuff, which is what we'd done the previous year. And so I really like Elixir. I really think it's great for security and OTP stuff. I'm really into this supply chain stuff, and I'm big into SBOM. And I'd taken Bruce Tate's, I learned Elixir from Bruce Tate's course way back when, and learned live view through it. And that involved this Tetris game, or not, you can't call it Tetris because that's trademarked, this Tetrominoes game that he made. And it's open source. So I took that and I modified it, and I made this thing called Quad Block Quiz. And you can go, well, actually, I probably have it turned off at the moment because we're redoing it for the upcoming RSA. But it's a quadblockquiz.org 4000. It's just HTTP because I didn't feel like playing with the certificates, which I need to get corrected. But it's again the falling blocks game that you do. We use the arrows to move this stuff over. But it's got an interesting cybersecurity twist to it. In that, I don't know if you noticed, but there was like a little yellow dot in there. There's vulnerabilities that can occur. And it's not just Tetris. It's also got a quiz aspect to it. And it asks things like, what's a software bill of materials? And none of it requires any prior knowledge. All of the answers are in the questions. So basically, it's a teaching tool. So it's not really trivia. It's really a teaching tool. And what you do when you answer the questions is you get power-ups that let you do interesting things. And there's a whole Phoenix section of questions that has Elixir and Erlang and Phoenix questions in it that get you a really neat power-up. That's the Phoenix is for rebirth, so it lets you basically wipe your board clean and start over again if you got too much crap in it. So it's a really good power-up to have, which means lots of people now know about it that didn't know about it before from playing. So again, got this game, you play it. If you get attacked, which just occurred there, boom, you're bankrupt and over, and you got whatever your score is. But on the website, one of the things you can click on, where the, well, I got it. Whoops, that went too far. Why didn't, I have no idea why the red arrow is not showing. I can see a slide on my next slide, and it's just not going to it. But anyway, pretend there is a red arrow under the word SBOM showing you where the word SBOM is. That if you click on it, it'll give you this big, huge in either JSON or XML, depending on either of CycloneDX or SPDX. It'll give you the actual SBOM for this site. It was created using hex SBOM. It then uses a command line tool from the CycloneDX crowd to turn the CycloneDX XBOM that you created into an SPDX SBOM. Like I said, it's just data and they're just formats. So you can have them in any multiple formats and multiple serializations by just running the same commands over again. So again, needed to walk my own talk and did that. My actual first SBOMs I did were part of Blinky Haha and Blinky Maha. Blinky is the hello, and these are from a code beam from several years ago, but also from several cybersecurity automation workshops, the next one of which will be in June, which I'll talk about in a second, because maybe you all can help me with it. But this is basically just, nerves running on a Raspberry Pi, a 3 in the one picture and a 0 in the other picture. One's got a big string of LEDs and the others, and they're supposed to be a GIF. They're supposed to be moving, but they're not. And the other is just one of the little, hats with, and that's again supposed to have the rainbows flowing through there. But those particular devices, besides running nerves, actually happen to be running a cybersecurity protocol called OpenC2 for Open Command and Control. It's used for controlling security devices. That has in it a command that says, "Hey, give me your SBOM," and it's sort of one of the underlying pieces that'll be in PACE eventually. And this is actually from, again, several years ago. So that's how I like playing with nerves. I like doing blinky light things, and blinky is because it's the the hello world of IoT. Haha stands for the HTTP actuator, which is an OpenC2 cited term. It's the sort of the particular way you're talking OpenC2 over HTTPS to it. And then the second ha is the hello world actuator, which is just a particular function in OpenC2, which is, hey, I don't do anything. I just say, world back when you say hello. So it's a very simple thing, but it's actually pretty fancy because it actually talks OpenC2. It gives you the SBOM back, and you can, the far side could then do evaluation or what if you want. It shows you can run OpenC2 on a Pi, shows you can keep the SBOM on a Pi, and they're basically trivial overheads. And Blinky Maha is basically the same thing, except for instead of being over HTTPS, it's over MQTT, which again is more common in the IoT world. It's a pub sub. So what are you guys all supposed to do now? Babbled at you. What is it I want you to do? I'll give you some stuff to do and give you some sort of takeaways from the talk. If you produce software, know what's in it, okay? If you purchase or use software, make the people who give you the software know what's in it, okay? Go to the NTIA or CISA sites to learn more. Use PACE or Cybeats or some other management system to keep track of all these SBOMs you're going to make. If you're interested, there is another upcoming cybersecurity workshop coming up this June. It'll be in DC on June 2nd. It will have Blinky Haha, Blinky Maha. It'll have a bunch of government boxes in it that talk this stuff. It's sort of the next generation of the meeting of the OpenC2 crowd with the SBOM crowd, with the Cacao crowd, with a bunch of people involved in cybersecurity automation. And to get all these boxes talking together, large medical device component people, a lot of medical device component people in hospitals, people go to it nowadays because SBOM is really big in their world due to some FDA mandates that came out even earlier than the EO. So get involved in that if you want to. Frank, for your benefit, this is the evolution of the one you went to a while ago. I got this, rinky-dink, blinky-ha, blinky-maha stuff that runs nerves and makes an SBOM for the nerves and makes the SBOM available over OpenC2 interfaces. Anybody wants to work on that with me, I welcome your help. Got this game that's going into this really big security conference. It's got a bunch of aspects to it. Part of the aspects to it are really just these quiz questions. Like I said, I already got a Phoenix section to it. We could make a nerve section to it if anyone wants to help me with the questions to put it in there. It's really an awareness and adoption type thing. I mean, people like playing Tetris. Again, can't call it Tetris, called quad blocks. People like playing it. These power-ups make it actually easier to play the game. And because of the vulnerability, the cyber attacks, and the license issues that come up, if you don't use the power-ups, you're going to lose unless you answer the questions and get some of the power-ups. And so it's really a training tool, and it's going to get used by a bunch of people at a big conference. So if people want sort of their view of what should be in it, it's an open source repo that just give me some pull requests to make some new questions or make a new section. And again, hit me up offline for how to do that. Sort of big picture takeaways from the talk. In cybersecurity, there are no silver bullets, but neither are we fighting mythical creatures called werewolves. We're a bunch of well-meaning defenders equipped with nightsticks and fighting off of mobs throwing rocks and bottles. We need to do a lot of things to prevent this and defend against it. We need riot shields. We need to not leave the rocks and bottles lying around. We all need to work together. So instead of silver bullets, we need riot guns, okay? Shotguns have many little rubber pellets in them, held together by a shell and shot out by gunpowder. So we need a lot of different things to make cybersecurity work. And some of those things are things like nerves and Elixir and having SBOMs and doing vexes and running things on OTP. And we need a lot of security stuff too. The thing that sort of powers the whole thing is automation. And the thing that holds it all together is the sharing of threat information and the sharing of SBOM information and lots of the sharing information that goes on in our community. Executive order came out on May 12th. I think it really is a game changer type event. If you forget anything else about my talk, remember this phrase, because that's sort of the core of what everybody needs to design their systems based on. If it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. If it does matter, it does. And you need to do my tagline, think evilly, act ethically, to think of what could go wrong and then act ethically to prevent it. If you're interested, I'd highly recommend joining I Am the Cavalry. You can Google it. It's iamthecavalry.org. It's a really great group of people. And again, saying it over and over and over again, create, require, and use SBOMs. And there's never enough time, but thank you for yours. And I think I'm right at just under an hour and ready for questions and answers and whatever we want to do next. Everybody still there? Anybody awake?
Yeah, I'll throw a question out. I'll start it off here. So it was really cool that you put like the SBOM for your own site there, like on the site itself. And one of the things that went through my mind on that I could think was probably going through like the minds of anyone else launching a commercial product is, do you actually expose yourself to more risk by posting your SBOM publicly? Because like, could an attacker just see that and know that you're then vulnerable to these certain exploits, or are there other benefits to actually doing that instead?
All righty. Excellent question. It's called the roadmap to the attacker question. It comes up all the time that everybody says, no, we can't do that. The attacker will find out information and attack us based on it. So let's look at the converse of that. Historically, SBOMs aren't available, and therefore no attacks have ever occurred, correct? That's the false, right? Attacks do occur. Why do they still occur? Okay, because the attacker doesn't need the SBOM, okay? They just go try every door, and if it's unlocked, they go in, okay? They don't need the map of where all the doors are and where the locks are and what our keys are to all our programmable things or whatever. They just go attack everything, and if it works, it works, and if it doesn't work, who cares? And then go on to the next one. Okay, so it's actually easier for an attacker to figure out what your software is than it is for you to figure out what your software is. Okay, because for some of the things they do to figure out what your software is, they're actually illegal to do. You can't even do it to yourself. Okay, but the hacker can because they don't care about laws. Okay, and the third is most software is open source. Most estimates have it at about 90% nowadays. All open source licenses that I know of require you to disclose that you're using it. Okay, so if you're doing it legally anyway, you already have, in fact, a lot of companies have these long lists of, hey, here's all the software we use already on their websites. They just don't have them organized by product in a way that actually the defender can use. They just have them in a way the attacker can use. So is it at least in theory of some value to the attacker? Yes. In any actual studies, in any real risk quantification work that I've ever done, it's always created more value than it's cost to do. So I even had a slide ready for that question because it always comes up.
I was going to say that one wasn't even planned, but you made it seem like it. That was great.
It was, I'll say, predictable. Well, I probably should be looking at chat too. I don't know if people said anything in the chat. I have not been looking at anything in chat.
I haven't seen any questions in the chat so far.
Any other questions? Well, I should probably. Oh, by the way, Alex, I tried doing the local record and it lets me do it on my own one, but it doesn't let me do it on yours. It was inhibited. So you have the only recording button. So I don't know if you want to keep it going or at what point you want to stop it.
Gotcha. No, this is good. I'll edit it up later. We'll just go through the Q&A and whenever we run out of questions, which maybe is now, then we'll just stop there.
Well, I have a question. So I'm motivated to do a little bit more SBOM work now. I think every time you give a talk, Duncan, you motivate me to do a little bit more. And I know that there are pieces.
Because you're one of my suppliers.
Yes. So I'm thinking I should start doing the similar thing with posting SBOMs. So there are tools to get at them, but like stuff like Nerve's Livebook, I could post the SBOM too, just like you did. Now, is that valuable? Should I just have it on CI when I make a release, have it post the SBOM output, or
yes,
is there something more?
I think it would be, and it'd be valuable in two dimensions. One is it would potentially be valuable to anybody who uses it, but two, it'd be valuable because it basically, just like the reason you're doing it in the first place, it's a training tool. It says, hey, look, oh, wait, you can do it. Look, he did it. Oh, what's actually in there? Oh, look, mine is the exact same thing, but I only got this one thing changed. I don't even need to use these fancy tools. I'll just take yours and edit out a line and add a third line. I mean, again, it'd be better to build it into the build tools, but people do still do stuff manually and stuff too. So I think it'd be valuable both as a training tool, but it'd be valuable to just, really all software should have SBOMs. And so if you're doing that, do it. And if you're doing it and you don't care if everybody knows it, then definitely put it out because A, it's just easier. And B, it starts that crowdsourcing of, I didn't know that was the component in there. How do you figure that out? And you talk to the person, or you look at it and I look at your SBOM and go, oh, Frank, you got some known unknowns there. Let's go figure out the build root thing to put it in there or whatever.
Yeah, cool. No, this would be easy. And it'd be easy on one sense, since the getting the Elixir side, getting the C side is currently still in CSV or JSON format, which is not your Cyclone DX. And it's just slightly awkward. It doesn't contain quite the right stuff. It contains a lot, but I think it's more focused on legal information than.
Well, one thing worth noting, I'll say from a Nerve's competitive viewpoint, I don't know, is Zephyr a competitor to Nerves, or is Zephyr a potential, maybe you'll put Nerves on top of Zephyr some year? Are you familiar with Zephyr?
Yeah, it comes up kind of in other contexts, like sometimes just makes sense to build something with Zephyr.
Because Zephyr builds SBOMs as part of its built-in tool chain. You can't build Zephyr without getting an SBOM. So from a competitive viewpoint, if it is, hey, I'm going to use Nerves or I'm going to use Zephyr, I would say we should work on getting Nerves as SBOM compliant as we can, because the Zephyr crowd happens to be run by the lady who runs the SBOM crowd. So they have a sort of their boss tells them to do it, they do it. So it's a vested interest kind of thing. We would do well to sort of compete well there.
Cool. Thank you.
I see a hand raised. Carl, you're up.
Yeah, so I'm super excited about hearing about all this. I joined this talk in my free time because I like Elixir and nerves, and it turns out this talk is really applicable to my job. At Comcast, I work in the open source program office. We are extremely concerned about SBOMs because we need to make sure that we are shipping stuff that is open source license compliant. Right. And that we're not doing copyleft violations all over the place. We have been struggling for years to be able to generate these things in a reasonable and automated fashion. As you can imagine, a company the size of Comcast has every language, every build tool, every possible combination and permutation of software in-house. And we keep coming across new projects that use different tools. We've got, NPM and Gradle and Maven and Swift code for iOS. And the trick, some of those have decent tools for traversing the dependency tree. Some of them don't. And then some of them we have to give permission to internal private repos to be able to traverse the dependency tree, right? We find it increasingly difficult to instrument these CI processes to be able to collect this data. I assume, but we haven't touched Cyclone DX yet.
Either Cyclone or SPDX. I don't have the tiny tools one on the SPDX. I thought I put it on both of them. I apologize. But there's a tiny CC. I think it's just SPDX is the letters after there, but I'm not going to swear it. Should be another one that you can go to the spdx.dev site and it'll have the link to all their tools. But both Cyclone DX and SPDX have basically build tools in every language I've ever heard of. And there's probably some exotic ones, but usually the people who bring up the exotic ones are, what about Erlang and Elixir? And we have them. So if we have them, everybody else must have them. But particularly like Maven and all those are, the tools exist, and pick whichever one you want, SPDX or Cyclone DX, I don't care which one. That crowd is a very helpful crowd in wanting for everybody to use their tools. So if you are, particularly if you care about the licensing, you're probably coming from the SPDX world. That SPDX group will help your developers get it built into their build processes.
That's cool. Thank you. I think a lot of what we've been trying to implement has been stuff we've been sold by vendors that is in varying states of disrepair.
Yep, and we have a long way to go before we get to my nirvana of we have complete SBOMs for everything. But we're gonna have to take it one step at a time. And all said and done, the executive order is going to galvanize a lot of that. And again, it's not in the FARs yet. They have till August to figure out what to put in the FARs, and then they'll probably give some grace period before they actually put it in their purchase orders. But once they start doing that, basically almost everybody is a federal contractor anyway. There's going to be an awful lot of, the Microsofts and the Oracles and everybody else in the world is actually on all these committees. They're all just going to have to start doing it, and they know it. And that'll make life a little bit easier because there'll be sort of a base to go from, and then the tools will get better and everything else. So I think we're probably still a year away from making your life easy. You can't just do it today, but there's actually the groundswell's already there that you can get a lot of it. And like I said, the communities, both those communities, the SPX community and the Cyclone DX community, are very, they want you to participate with them, to give them problems for them to help you to solve.
That's terrific. Thank you.
Anything else? I could probably stop sharing.
I guess one of the other things I'm seeing here is maybe maybe a little comment. I don't know if you have anything to add to it or give it a thumbs up or whatever, but you had that one slide that showed basically like the known unknowns coming off of a dependency kind of on the other end of it as one of the benefits you get to an SBOM. And so kind of like thinking of that slide in my head and then hearing about what Carl just said about the open source licenses and all that is one of the things that seems like it could be valuable just by the act of running an SBOM over your software. It looks like it could help you potentially like even just prune out the things that you're not actually using, because just some of the dependencies days that just come along with a whole bunch of extra cruft to them. And it seems like from the security perspective as well, as that could just help. Like you said, if the dependency does, or if that component doesn't exist, then it's not a security problem. And so just the sheer act of just cutting out some of those dependencies that might not be in use in your project, that kind of like piggybacked off of something else might be useful, I'm seeing.
Real life use case of a real life example of what you just said. So Quad Block Quiz, this game I made a year ago for this conference, I had a couple people help me with it, is built on Phoenix, built on LiveView. LiveView uses a bunch of JavaScript libraries. Literally every single week for the last year, well, up until we did something I'm about to talk about, we were dealing with Dependabot. It's on GitHub. Gindot has the Dependabot that runs over it. It runs over the JavaScript and says, hey, npm node.js has whatever this npm module has, whatever dependency came up. And we were doing them basically continuously. That it got annoying enough that we said, do we actually really need all this Node.js stuff? I mean, we need some of it. Do we need all of it? And we did exactly what you said, and we pruned it down just to get rid of the Dependabot noise. And the reality is, from a cybersecurity viewpoint, we not only got rid of the Dependabot noise, we got rid of a lot of attack surface that is valid attack surface that is stuff we didn't need. Our code is smaller now, and it's easier to maintain because we don't have as much crap in it. And so there's a lot of value you get out of doing this that you sort of don't know the value till after you've done it.
Yeah, totally. I could see that like being useful for the embedded systems too, because if you're for nerves, for example, because if you're shipping those out to somebody, I think it might have been Boyd, if I remember right, who because he was involved in the Xbox stuff and kind of, I think he or somebody else at Microsoft had a really good talk on like Xbox vulnerability stuff, and just trying to like prune as much out of an embedded system as you can as well. And so I could see that being like directly applicable to nerves.
Yep. And it's important to do the SBOM when you do that pruning, because from a vulnerability viewpoint, a lot of the third-party vulnerability scanners, so not based on, hey, I'm actually looking at the build and made the real SBOM, but based on hey, I'm going to go look at your executable and I'm going to infer that you have this software in you because I find these particular patterns. And they don't really literally look at every bit you have. They look for these sort of like key patterns. It says, oh yeah, you're using OpenSSL 0.9. They don't look that you actually have the attackable module. They're looking at just sort of the header part that says you have this big blob of software that if you do your pruning correctly and you don't have that particular vulnerable component, you were just using the random number generator, then your SBOM will say, yeah, we got this higher level component, but the only subcomponent we have of it is the random number generator, not the communications module that has the vulnerability. So yeah, your scanner is wrong, and I can prove it. And again, there's a lot of wasted time on false negatives from these scanners that if you had SBOMs, you wouldn't waste that time. You just go, no, look, I don't have that. It's component not present. Move on.
It seems to me that this would be additionally valuable in the selection of open source to include in a project. I mean, software engineering for years has been riddled with folks that have just pulled in whatever tool they could find to get to the, get the product shipped with the features that they wanted, right? You just pull in whatever open source library and you want, but if you had this additional information for libraries, it would give you a better way to evaluate them.
Yeah, I mean, all said and done, software is becoming more like a factory, and we should be starting to learn from the things that factory have learned over the years. If you know the Deming principles, it's pick the highest quality supplier, pick the highest quality parts from the highest quality supplier, and keep track of where all those parts are. That's the sort of core of Deming, okay? And that's how you run factories. Well, guess what? Those 3 sentences apply to software components.
So I'm curious, just want to see if I'm following this. So basically, for any of the softwares that you might be using, for instance, I'm using Phoenix and Elixir, I just go to Cyclone DX and go down and find the language or tool that I'm using and then go to it. And for Phoenix or for Elixir, there's a SBOM module.
Yeah, you could do it that way, or you could skip right to it and just you're building with Elixir. So you're using Hex as your package manager. Just load the Hex module called SBOM. SBOM.
Right. But if I didn't know what it was,
if you didn't know that, or because it's not Elixir, you want to do it for Java, you want to do it for your Maven stuff, then yes, go to Cyclone DX, look in there, what's called Tool Center, and go find the Java tools or find the Jenkins plugin. You want to put it in Jenkins. There's a Jenkins plugin.
And then I just run.
There's like 100 tools on there.
And then for the Hex package, I just run this as part of my build process, and it looks to see that I'm using Phoenix and Cowboy and whatever.
Correct. It looks and sees that you're using Phoenix and sees that Phoenix is using Cowboy and or better yet, it sees that LiveView is using Phoenix and Phoenix is using Cowboy and Cowboy is using Ranch and Ranch is using, I don't know, I forget what the next, there's another layer and I forget what it is, but whatever, it does that for you.
Oh, okay, cool.
Which it's all said and done, Elixir is nicer than some other languages in that if you wanted to, you could actually just go look when you did the build at your dependencies, and you'll actually see your dependency directory has all that stuff in it, because all said and done, your build had to know this to build the thing. So it's not like it had to do a lot of work to figure this out. It's sort of like it has the info. It's just, I got to spit it out in this particular weird format that you got to stick the stuff in. But it needed it. But if it pulled the info from the package manager, then it only knows it pulled the binary. It doesn't, like, let's use nerves as the best example. It only knows it pulled this big, huge, executable that's called nerves, or set of X files that's stuck together in a manifest called nerves. It doesn't actually have when it got built, what were its components? So that's a case where you get to, Bob's browser and you're using nerves, but you don't know all the components of it. And that's where Frank and I were talking earlier. There's still some work we got to do there, because all said and done, it's a lot of C. It's not the Elixir stuff. It's the C stuff. It's the Linux build stuff. But on that website that I showed you before, I actually used a bunch of containers. There's container build tools. So like I use a standard Elixir container, and somebody went ahead and ran the dependency. I didn't even do it. Somebody else ran the SBOM tool, container tool to create SBOMs on the Elixir container. And on my website is the container I use, and it's SBOM because I just, pulled it from the package that when I pulled the container, I could pull the SBOM. It happens to be only a one-level SBOM. It doesn't have some of the details in it that, again, I got to work on some of that stuff. But again, it's as everybody does a little bit, you get a little bit more of the tree that everybody else then can use. I see another hand up. Oop, Matthew disappeared.
Here I am. Can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Okay. So I'm new to nerves, and I used Elixir a long time ago, and I'm kind of rediscovering it. And I wanted to kind of I see part of this talk as challenges for nerves, and I'm curious because the model for the Erlang VM is to have like one VM where all of these services or all of the threads are shared in one VM, as opposed to like a traditional Linux system where you have some more separation. And is that, or in your experience, or is that a challenge to the environment?
I argue that's a benefit, because the next layer down from that, they are separate Erlang processes. So they are actually a much more distributed system that are like, for example, when you run Phoenix as a web server, and I go to the website and you go to the website, we're actually running on different web servers. We actually spin up, down in the guts, you're actually spinning up different processes. They're not different Linux processes, they're different Erlang processes. And all said and done, the Erlang processes are better separated from a security viewpoint than the Linux processes are. Now, there are some challenges, there are some gotchas. Changing your software on the fly is a great security feature and a horrible security feature. It must be used carefully and well. In fact, at the last one of these meetings, I think it was the last one of these meetings, some of the WhatsApp guys were talking about some of the work that they'd done in some of the basically shared stuff across Erlang nodes, because that's, again, one node can take down all the other nodes if you're not careful in how you do things. And so there's some ways to do it right and ways to do it wrong, but the capability to do it right is there.
To add on to that question, in the traditional Linux model, you can have capabilities assigned per Linux process, whereas the whole VM is running in one Linux process. So wouldn't it share all of the capabilities so that you can't separate those as easily? Or
Hey, Duncan, do you mind if I answer
Go
a
ahead,
little bit?
go for it.
So, yes, you're right. There are a whole bunch of things that you can get in that area, and some people take advantage of that too. I think it depends on, by default, one Erlang VM is what you get with nerves, and that is fine for a lot of people. But if your system starts getting a lot of complexity, I think that you're probably going to be interested in taking advantage of some of those features. And some people do that, and they have child Erlang VMs and then communicate with them. At the end of the day, theirs is basically a very minimalist Linux system and can take on all that. It's I think we start at a place that's here, and then if those concerns are important for whatever your application that you're building on, you can isolate them using the Linux mechanisms if that's what works best for.
I see. So you just spin up another Erlang VM if you want to add. Okay,
Erlang,
okay, got it.
It has a feature to do that. There are lots of ways at solving these problems. I think that's what your question is going to, and there's some case by case on how much work you put into each one.
Right. And what the threat is from a security viewpoint, you need to look at what the threat is and what is the mitigation for the threat and what's the best way to do it. And that usually is a situation dependent. It's different for different things.
Yeah.
I will say in general, on average, the OTP systems, I think, are inherently, you're less likely to make it insecure by accident than you are in other systems. Anything else? Well, then I will turn it back over to Alex.
Cool. Thank you very much, Duncan.